This episode is very much a cautionary tale that begs the question, how much loyalty is too much loyalty? And how can it become toxic, not only for the person who is loyal, but also for the person who they are so loyal and devoted to? Welcome back to Can We Talk About the Apothecary Diaries in excruciating detail, the series where we overanalyze every single word, meaningful glance, and imperial decree that this story throws our way. My name is Yumna, my current hyperfixation is the Apothecary Diaries, and today we're going to be talking about Season 1, Episode 11, where things are more sad than they are sinister, and we are once again reminded of the drawbacks of being a concubine. This episode opens with Maomao once again returning to the Garnet Pavilion under the guise that she has a letter from Lady Gyokyo that has to be dropped off in person. When Fongming lets Maomao know that Adwo is actually out at tea, Maomao doesn't say anything. She just opens this mysterious box that she's holding, and after seeing the contents, Fongming promptly lets her inside. And the energy is feeling quite sinister, beyond the fact that they are sitting in quite a dark room and Fongming is using a pretty hefty cleaver to chop up some snacks for Maomao. She is just being a little standoffish, not outright rude, but definitely not warm and kind in the way that she was in the last episode, where Maomao described her as being approachable, whereas right now she is anything but. Maomao then clocks that this cleanup day that she helped out with was not a cleanup day, it was a packing to move day, because the rumors are true and Adwo is being removed from her position as a high-ranking concubine because she can no longer have children to make way for a new girl who is going to be introduced during the upcoming New Year's celebrations. She then asks Fongming what happened on the night that Adwo gave birth, and when Fongming understandably asks why that is any of Maomao's business, she reveals that it was her father Loman who delivered the baby, along with the imperial younger brother who was also born that night, whose birth was deemed more important than Adwo's. Now this revelation strikes a nerve with Fongming, and her standoffish yet composed demeanor starts to crack as she stands up in shock. We then get a flashback to the night that Adwo gave birth, and to be frank, it is awful. She's exhausted and in pain, and Maomao suspects that because of the delay in Loman getting to her to help out because the Empress Dowager took priority, Adwo lost her uterus and subsequently could not have any more children. Maomao then shows her hand and tells Fongming that it seems as though she is blaming herself still for the death of Adwo's baby 16 years ago. And Fongming does not deny these suspicions. She simply replies by telling Maomao that she has figured it out, despite the fact that she is the daughter of that incompetent charlatan. Now, Maomao doesn't defend Loman from this statement, which I think we all know is far from accurate, but it is clear that it bothers her because she puts her hands into a fist under the table. But I do want us to keep this description of Loman in mind for a discussion later in this video, because I think that this attribution says a lot about Fongming as a person, especially when we get some more context for what Loman was doing that night. And then things continue to get dark as Maomao challenges the rumored cause of death for Adwo's baby at the time, which was the toxic face powder that also killed Li Hua's son, and how that would not make sense because the charlatan in question, Loman, had that powder banned when he was in the rear palace. And so Maomao surmises that the baby's actual cause of death was honey, specifically honey made from flowers whose nectar can be toxic, because while it is not dangerous for adults to consume honey like that, it can be lethal for babies. But people didn't know this, so at the time the baby's cause of death was a mystery, but that all changed once concubine Li Shu came to the rear palace during the previous emperor's reign, because she became close with Adwo, and as we see from the flashbacks, there was definitely this level of codependency, a symbiotic relationship where you had this girl who was incredibly young, taken from her parents incredibly young, and a mother who had lost her child and could no longer have any more children, and so the two of them leaned on each other quite a bit. But through Li Shu, Fongming learned that babies can die from honey and that honey can be lethal for them because of her own experience with it when she was a baby. And after learning this, Fongming decides that the only possible course of action is for her to do everything conceivably possible to dodge accountability for this mistake that she made. And so she starts chasing Li Shu out of the Garnet Pavilion. And I want to remind everybody that this was during the previous emperor's reign, so Li Shu would have been 9 years old. So Fongming chases this child away who has no other source of comfort in the rear palace, and honestly was also a comfort for her mistress, who did not have children of her own, because she was so scared that this story was going to get repeated and that Adwo was going to find out what actually killed her son. And then we see in the flashbacks that the previous emperor dies and Li Shu is sent away, and Fongming breathes a sigh of relief. But then Li Shu comes back, and Maomao surmises that this likely threw Fongming into a bit of a tizzy, because not only was this girl back who could reveal the truth about the honey, she was also now a potential threat to Adwo's status as a high-ranking concubine. And so Fongming, once again, commits herself to dodging accountability by conspiring to get rid of Li Shu for good through poisoning her, which would not only allow for her secret to be kept a secret, but would also potentially help Adwo retain her status as a high-ranking concubine. And so after Maomao provides this entire explanation and we see all these flashbacks, Fongming has been thoroughly clocked, and she can really only say one thing to Maomao, which is asking her what she wants, and tells her to literally name anything, which is obviously a last-ditch effort to bribe Maomao into silence and to dodge accountability for her one mistake, really her many mistakes, one more time. We then get some more flashbacks which provide us with some context for Fongming's relationship with Adwo, how she came to serve her in the first place, and gives us an understanding of how we got to this point today and how Fongming got to the point of having the type of mindset that she did. And that context being that Fongming truly idolized Adwo. She saw her as this woman who could go toe-to-toe with the crown prince and speak to him as an equal. She saw her as this woman who had an incredibly strong will, something that many women, including Fongming, did not have, were not raised to have, given the social norms of the world of the Apothecary Diaries, where women are very much taught to serve and obey their parents and families, and then after that, serve and obey their husbands. And so when Fongming learned the truth and learned that it was her mistake that caused the death of Adwo's baby, she is racked with an incredible amount of guilt at having taken away the one thing that Adwo cherished the most in this world. And knowing that despite the fact that this is a woman who is incredibly strong-willed, Adwo cried every single night and was incredibly devastated by the loss of her child. And so Fongming spends the next 16 years living with this guilt and continuing to be fully devoted to serving her mistress. And as Maomao is watching this woman sob on the floor, letting out 16 years worth of guilt, she notes that she cannot understand or relate to the way that Fongming is feeling, because she doesn't have it in her to let anybody into her heart like that, to love somebody so deeply and unconditionally in this way, which makes a lot of sense when we learn about Maomao's parents' story later on in this season. But in general, I think that that type of love and devotion is incredibly fickle and just precarious in the way that it can escalate to this point where you are willing to take the life of somebody else on account of your own intense loyalty and desire to stay by someone's side. And so Maomao does the only thing she really can do in this situation as somebody with very little power and social currency in the rear palace, which is to provide Fongming with a way by which she can continue to keep this secret from Adwo. It doesn't change the end result, which is going to be execution, given the fact that Fongming tried to kill a concubine, but it would ensure that Adwo never finds out the truth, which is the reason that Fongming did all of this in the first place. And Maomao suggests that she do this by taking her two motives and turning them into one, reducing 2 to 1, the title of the episode, where instead of Fongming's motivation being to hide the truth about Adwo's son's death and to protect Adwo's position as a high-ranking concubine in the rear palace, just make everything about protecting Adwo's position. And after giving that suggestion, there really isn't anything left to be said, so Maomao leaves the Garnet Pavilion and we see Adwo watching her walk away from the balcony of her house, which makes me wonder if she heard the entire conversation. And now let's take a second to talk about Fongming, because I actually found her to be a lot more unlikable on this rewatch than I have on previous watches. I feel like on previous watches, I have just felt pity for her and kept it pushing. But while I was watching and scripting, all I could think about was, oh, she is wildly selfish, actually. I said earlier in this video that I think this episode was a really interesting exploration into the pitfalls of intense loyalty, and I think whether Fongming realized it or not, at least to me personally, her loyalties seem to be more about herself than about Adwo. And that isn't me saying that she didn't respect and care deeply for Adwo. I think that her love for the pure consort is incredibly obvious given the way that her guilt completely consumes her in this conversation with Maomao, where by the end of it she is just on the ground sobbing. But two things can be true at the same time. And while I think it is obvious that Fongming loved Aduo, she was also incredibly wrong for going about things the way that she did, for going to the lengths that she did to prevent the potential reveal of her mistake. A mistake that was honest because no one knew the risk that Honey could pose. It was a genuine accident that this happened. But instead of letting things play out and accepting responsibility if Aduo were to find out the truth about Honey through hearing Li Shu's story, or instead of just plainly going to Aduo after finding out this information from Li Shu, Fongming decides that she is going to hide this by any means necessary. Like, instead of treating the matter with integrity and being honest with this mistress that she loves and cares about so much, Fongming opts to drive a literal child away, a child whose, companionship her mistress also valued. And Aduo's affection for Li Shu only becomes more clear as the light novels progress. Something else to note is that in the light novel, in her internal dialogue, Maomao theorizes that the reason that Aduo potentially spent a lot of time with Li Shu during the previous emperor's reign was to prevent him from coming to visit Li Shu, which I feel like just adds another level of bleak to this entire situation. And again, despite knowing that Aduo does care for this girl, Fongming still conspires to literally kill her. And while obviously a potential reason for all of this could be just to protect Aduo and her position as a high-ranking concubine, given her age, given the fact that she can't have children, I feel like that is kind of flimsy reasoning, given the fact that with everything we know about the way that the rear palace functions, Aduo was going to be replaced eventually, regardless of Li Shu's presence. I feel like more likely reasoning, given everything that we learn about Fongming in this episode, is that if she were to take accountability, if she were to be honest and tell Aduo that this is what happened, this is what I learned many years after this baby's death, mind you, there was potentially the chance that Aduo might not see her the same way anymore, or might even no longer want Fongming in her service. Or there was also the potential for her to get punished in some kind of way. And the kind of common thread through all of these feared possibilities is Aduo no longer seeing Fongming the same way, or Aduo no longer wanting Fongming around. And I think there is some nuance here to acknowledge the fact that in the rear palace, oftentimes mistakes are punished severely, even if they are honest ones. But I think given who Aduo is as a person, and given Li Hua's situation that we see earlier in this season and the consequences that her lady-in-waiting faces, I think it is fair to say that Fongming, even if she did face a punishment, would not have been a particularly severe one, and not one that resulted in her being removed from Aduo's service. And I guess you could also argue that Fongming didn't want Aduo to be devastated all over again, learning that her son's death was entirely preventable, seeing how destroyed she was when he did die, but I fear this was not the way to go about it regardless. Speaking of Li Hua, I have just been thinking a lot about her as I have been writing the script for this episode, because she goes through an incredibly similar experience to Aduo earlier in this season, where she loses her son to an ailment due to a mistake made by her staff that was entirely preventable. Though honestly, in the case of Li Hua, I think it's even worse because of the arrogance and haughtiness of her ladies-in-waiting. And while it did devastate her, she survived and she persisted. And with that in mind, if Fongming's motivation was truly just to protect Aduo, to protect her position and to protect her feelings, and wasn't driven by her own selfishness and excessive loyalty and desire to dodge accountability, she is still wrong, because trying to protect her like this is to lose sight of why she came to admire and respect Aduo so much in the first place, which is her strong will as a woman. And frankly, it just wasn't up to Fongming to dictate whether Aduo should have this information or could handle having this information. So really, no matter how you slice it, while this situation was devastating for many people involved, Fongming, Li Shu, Aduo, we really did not have to get to this point. Things did not have to play out this way. Li Shu did not have to lose her only comfort in the rear palace as a literal child. And Fongming did not have to let her love and loyalty for Aduo dictate her actions so intensely that she got to the point where she thought it was okay to take the life of someone else whose only crime was eating honey as a child, which inevitably ends to Fongming sealing her fate and meeting a very tragic end via execution. Now, earlier in this video, I said that I wanted us to keep Fongming calling Loman an incompetent charlatan in mind, and I want to talk about it here. Given everything that we just discussed about accountability and Fongming dodging accountability, I think that a flashback that we get towards the end of this episode about what Loman was actually doing in Aduo's delivery room is very important to bring up. And we see point that this alleged incompetent charlatan was actively fighting to be at Adwo's side. We've seen that Loman is an incredibly soft-spoken person, but in this flashback, he is raising his voice. He is raising his voice saying, "What are you doing? I must tend to her," as the eunuchs are dragging him, physically dragging him out of this room because the Empress Dowager's delivery takes priority. Loman did not want to leave, and he would not have left if he wasn't forced to. And while he definitely has an interesting personality, like every member of the Law clan seems to, it is incredibly clear that Loman is intelligent and a very skilled physician that the Rear Palace was very lucky to have. We see his intelligence and skills manifested in Maomao and how under his tutelage she has become this incredibly competent person. And we also see it in episode 8 of season 1, Wheatstalks, where Loman is able to figure out in probably less than an hour what takes Maomao an entire episode. And one of the reasons the Rear Palace was so lucky to have him is because of his willingness to become a eunuch, because in the light novel, Maomao talks about how they are always short-staffed when it comes to physicians because no skilled professional wants to become a eunuch in order to serve in the Rear Palace, hence the reason the quack doctor has a job at all. And in that way, I feel like Fongming giving him this very inaccurate and unfair characterization says a lot about accountability and her ability to take accountability. Because in giving Loman this unfair attribution, in trying to get rid of Li Shu permanently, Fongming is projecting her feelings of guilt and her distress over her feelings of guilt onto other people that have nothing to do with what happened and what she did. It really is interesting to see that even after watching a piece of media the amount of times that I have watched the Apothecary Diaries, I can still change my opinion on characters. I can still have way more to say about a character than I had on previous watches. Hi, quick intermission from post-production Yumna, because I think it is also important to acknowledge with everything that we've just talked about that Fongming did not just fall out of a coconut tree, and she very much does exist in the context of the world of the Apothecary Diaries, specifically the context of being in the Rear Palace, being in service to a concubine in the Rear Palace. And I think that this environment is, one, just incredibly competitive and dangerous, but also very insular. Fongming has been serving Adwo since she was quite young. Like, it's been almost 2 decades of being in service to this woman. And when you have been stuck in a place for 2 decades in the same way that your mistress has, when your whole life has just been serving this one person and starting to do it from quite a young age, you are going to have maybe this type of mindset. I don't think that it's so out of the blue for Fongming to approach a problem like this. I think that this is also a result of being incredibly sheltered, and I think it's a result of being in a system, being part of a system, being in service to a system where one of the most important things you need to be as a lady in waiting is loyal. And I feel like that's an important nuance to acknowledge here. But with all that being said, we then cut to Maomao back at the Jade Pavilion with Gaoxuan and Jinshi, feigning ignorance, acting like she has no idea that Fongming turned herself in. And Jinshi is finding all of this very strange, given the fact that Fongming's reasoning falls a little flat and is a little flimsy when we learn that the decision to have Adwo leave the Rear Palace was made quite a long time ago and was the Emperor's call. And so this is old news. It is old news that Adwo is going to be leaving and moving to an imperial villa that is also still on the palace grounds, but in the south. But there isn't really much to gain from pressing Maomao because what's happened has happened, so Jinshi just lets it go. But what I think is interesting is that in the light novel, Fongming doesn't turn herself in, she just takes her own life. And I think this change was probably made because we already had a servant take her own life for Adwo in this whole situation, and also because Fongming officially confessing and officially going through the process of being executed helps to set the stage for the next problem we're going to be dealing with in the next episode. And with that discussion over, it's been quite a long day for Maomao. It is now nighttime, and Jinshi pays a visit to Adwo while Maomao is tossing and turning in bed. After a while, she decides that she is not going to be able to sleep and wants to take a walk, which leads her to the Rear Palace wall and leads her to scaling the wall using the protrusions that we learned about a couple of episodes ago. And once Maomao gets to the top, we learn that concubine Fuyo is not the only concubine that has the footwork needed to be able to scale this wall, as Maomao comes face to face with none other than concubine Adwo dressed in men's clothing. But before we get into their conversation, which is an incredibly important one, I just want to point out something about the Rear Palace that the anime leaves out, which is that in the light novel, novel, when Maomao is on her nighttime walk, before she gets to the wall and starts scaling it, she notes that the rear palace is rife with promiscuity and that she needs to be careful to not look too closely at the bushes or the shadows. Because, and I quote, "For those who burned with passion, the winter chill presented no obstacle." So yeah, people are getting their freak on in the rear palace, which isn't unexpected given just the sheer volume of eunuchs, concubines, ladies in waiting, servants, all just sitting in this confined space. Yeah, just a little funny, got a little chuckle out of me, and I'm sad that they left it out of the anime. But back to Aduo and Maomao on the wall. Aduo invites Maomao to stay and have a drink with her, and then proceeds to get very candid about her life. She tells Maomao that after her son left her, her role entirely changed and she went from being the emperor's concubine to going back to being his friend, and that she never really thought that she would be a concubine in the first place, and once everything happened, she was incredibly eager to kind of pass it off to someone else, and she just ponders why she stayed for as long as she did in the rear palace. And finally, she stands up and pours a drink into the moat in honor of the servant who took her own life in order to remove suspicion from her mistress. Now, all of this is happening on the eve of Aduo leaving the rear palace, and I can't help but just feel so much empathy for her. She's leaving this place that she's lived in for a very long time, and she is leaving off the heels of finding out that two people in her service resigned themselves to death out of loyalty for her, something that she did not ask for and probably didn't want them to do. She's also just somebody who is so clearly a free spirit, given her candor, given how she's dressed, given how she drinks her alcohol. Nothing about her strikes you as somebody who is meant to be a concubine in the rear palace, in this confined space that is designed for having children, something that she cannot do, which also means that she can't find solace in that role, because while being a concubine is tedious and life-threatening a lot of the times, these women do find joy in motherhood, but that is something that Aduo cannot do. And so I imagine that being here for as long as she has without having children must have been incredibly lonely and suffocating at times. And even now, even with her leaving this place that is quite restrictive, her villa is still on palace grounds. She's not just free to roam the world. Something that Maomao reflects upon during this conversation in the light novel is Aduo's personality and her spirited and resilient nature, and how those two things combined are useful when you are in the business of ruling people, and how under different circumstances, if Aduo was able to stand at the emperor's side in that context, that could be quite beneficial politically, which is interesting when we consider future storylines in the light novels. After this conversation, Aduo leaves, and a little while later, Maomao follows her lead, only to run into Jinshi, who causes her to fall on her climb back down from the wall. And where does she land when she falls? On top of him, because where else would she land? Jinshi then proceeds to trap Maomao in a back hug, and we realize that he is quite inebriated. Aduo loaded him up with booze and sent him on his way. And as Maomao is trying to leave, she realizes that Jinshi is crying, and he pleads with her to just stay with him a little bit longer to keep him warm, and she does. And I think that this moment is a real testament to Jinshi's close relationships with some of the concubines in the rear palace. We have seen this in his dynamic with Gyokyo and now with Aduo, and Aduo especially makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that she has been in Jinshi's life for his whole life. Putting potential parentage aside, she has just been there due to her relationship with the emperor, living in this place where he was also raised as a member of the royal family. And so to see her go is understandably sad for him. And now it is the next day, and it's time for Aduo's formal exit from the rear palace. And it's during this ceremony where Aduo has to hand over her crown that signified her as the pure consort to Jinshi, the manager of the rear palace, that Maomao suddenly has an epiphany. And then she proceeds to casually give us arguably the biggest reveal in the story so far, because she finally realizes that the person that Aduo reminded her of was Jinshi. And in seeing their resemblance, Maomao starts thinking about the specific verbiage language that Adwo used the night before to describe her son no longer being with her. She described him as having left her, not that he died. And in thinking about that, Maomao starts to ponder whether there was a potential baby swap that might have happened. Given how her delivery went, it's fair to assume that Adwo was left pondering some things, that she was left pondering how her child, the child of a wet nurse's daughter, a childhood friend of the prince who has no kind of strong family backing or social status, would be treated in this world, in this place. And so perhaps in this state, with this reality being slapped in her face, Adwo made a decision that would have given her son a better chance of surviving and thriving in this world. Maomao thinks that it would also explain the precariousness of the emperor's younger brother's position, and also provide a potential explanation as to why somebody as realistic as Adwo stuck around in the rear palace for as long as she did. But after going through this thought process, Maomao shrugs all of this off as complete nonsense and is disappointed with herself for even coming up with it in the first place. And then, as if there weren't enough reveals in this episode, we get one final one to close us out. Because upon her execution, Jinshi has received a list of all of Fongming's family and their known associates, who will all be receiving various forms of punishment for this conspiracy, like getting their assets seized, getting mutilated in some kind of way, or getting fired from their service in the rear palace. And on this list is a certain person's name, the name of somebody who was kidnapped and brought to the rear palace against her will. It turns out that Maomao's kidnappers are one of Fongming's family's associates, which is obviously going to make things a little bit complicated for us in the next episode. And that is all for this episode. How are we feeling about Fongming? Do we feel like she was selfish or just too earnest, or both? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video and want to stay updated on when new videos in this series come out, don't forget to subscribe. And as always, can we talk about that?